The thermometer outside Elias Drummond's cabin read 28 degrees below zero, and the blizzard had been screaming across Silver Ridge for 36 hours without pause. Inside, while his neighbors' fires died and their cabins turned to frozen tombs, Elias crouched beside a stone-lined pit in his floor, adjusting embers that glowed 4 feet below ground level, kept alive by an innovation that everyone had called insane until the storm proved them dead wrong. Before we see how Elias survived what others couldn't, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity like this one move you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The year was 1876, and Silver Ridge sat at an altitude where winter killed careless men with methodical efficiency. The mining camp clung to a mountainside in the Colorado Rockies, 9,200 feet above sea level, where October brought snow and November brought cold that could stop a man's heart if he stayed outside too long. Elias Drummond had survived 3 winters in this unforgiving place, working a modest silver claim that paid enough to keep him fed and equipped, but never enough to make him rich. His cabin sat on the eastern edge of camp, a standard log structure that looked identical to 24 others scattered across the ridge. The cabin measured 16 feet by 14 feet, with walls made from lodgepole pine logs notched at the corners and chinked with moss and clay. A single door faced south. One small window covered with oiled paper let in dim light. The roof was split, shakes overlaid with sod. Against the north wall stood a stone fireplace, 5 feet tall, with a chimney that extended 3 feet above the roof line. The fireplace was built from river rock, mortared with clay, and it burned through a cord of wood every 4 days when temperatures dropped below zero. This was standard construction, proven over decades of frontier settlement, adequate for survival if a man stayed vigilant and kept his woodpile stocked. Owen Carlisle's cabin sat 50 yards downslope from Elias's place. Owen was a cheerful man from Pennsylvania who had come west 5 years earlier, chasing silver dreams like everyone else. He and Elias had partnered on several claims, helping each other with heavy work, sharing meals occasionally, maintaining the kind of casual friendship that developed between neighbors who understood that survival sometimes required cooperation. Owen's cabin was nearly identical to Elias's. Same dimensions, same log construction, same stone fireplace, burning the same amount of wood to maintain the same barely adequate warmth through the long mountain winter. On an afternoon in mid-October, with the first significant snow beginning to fall, Elias stood outside splitting wood while Owen walked up from his claim carrying a canvas bag of ore samples. The temperature hovered around freezing, and fat snowflakes drifted down through still air, the kind of gentle snow that wouldn't cause problems but signaled the start of the season that would. Getting the woodpile built up? Owen stopped to watch Elias work, his breath forming clouds in the cooling air. "Trying to get ahead of it this year," Elias said, setting another round on his chopping block. "Last winter I was cutting in January, which is miserable work. I'm 2 cords short of where I want to be." Owen shifted his ore bag to his other shoulder. "Probably need another 3 weeks of cutting to feel comfortable." Elias brought the axe down, splitting the round cleanly. "You ever think about heat different?" Owen looked puzzled. "How do you mean?" "Just wondering if there's a better way than burning through a cord every 4 days." Elias stacked the split pieces. "Seems like most of what we burn goes up the chimney." "That's how fireplaces work." Owen shrugged. "Heat rises. Not much to be done about that." "Probably right." Elias set another round, but the thought stayed with him as snow continued to fall and evening approached. The blizzard hit Silver Ridge on November 23, 1876, arriving with a ferocity that veteran prospectors would remember for years afterward. Elias woke before dawn to whine that sounded like a freight train hitting the mountain, and by the time gray light filtered through his window, visibility had dropped to nothing. Snow fell horizontally, driven by gusts that shook his cabin and found every gap in the chinking. The temperature had plummeted overnight to 15 degrees below zero, and the wind made it feel twice that cold. Elias spent the first day feeding his fireplace constantly, burning wood faster than he liked, but unable to maintain comfortable warmth any other way. The wind created erratic drafts that sometimes pulled smoke into the cabin and other times howled down the chimney, threatening to extinguish the fire entirely. He stayed close to the hearth, wrapped in blankets, listening to the storm rage outside and hoping his chimney would stay clear. The second day brought no relief. If anything, the wind intensified and the cold deepened. Elias rationed his wood, knowing the storm might last another day or more. He let the fire burn lower than he wanted, accepting the cold rather than risking running out of fuel. Through the small gaps around his door, he could see nothing but white chaos. The third day dawned quieter. The wind had died some time before sunrise, and though snow still fell lightly, the blizzard's fury had passed. Elias waited until full daylight before venturing outside. The landscape had transformed completely. Drifts reached his cabin's eaves in places. Trees he recognized were buried to their lower branches. The trail between cabins had disappeared under 8 feet of snow in some sections. He struggled through the drifts toward Owen's cabin, concerned because no smoke rose from Owen's chimney. The silence felt wrong. When he reached the door, he found it unlatched. Inside, the cabin was bitterly cold, the fireplace dead and dark. Owen lay in his bedroll near the hearth, frozen solid, his face peaceful as if he had simply gone to sleep. Elias stood in the doorway, trying to understand what had happened. Wood remained stacked against the wall. Owen's rifle leaned in the corner. Everything looked normal except for the man who would never wake up and the cold fireplace that had failed him. Elias examined the chimney from inside and understood immediately. Ice and snow had clogged the top during the storm's worst hours. A downdraft had extinguished Owen's fire. Without heat, in temperatures that cold, hypothermia had taken Owen within hours, probably while he slept, too cold to wake and relight the fire, even if he could have done so against the wind. Victor Ashford and 2 other prospectors helped Elias carry Owen's body up the ridge. They buried him in a rocky area where the wind had scoured most of the snow away, piling stones over the grave because the ground was frozen too hard to dig properly. Nobody said much. Death was part of mountain life, accepted as the price men paid for freedom and the possibility of silver. But Elias could not accept it. Owen had died with fuel, with shelter, with everything he needed except reliable heat. December brought steady cold to Silver Ridge, and Elias spent those weeks studying fire and heat with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He sat in his cabin for hours, watching flames in his fireplace, noting how heat rose immediately up the chimney while the air near the floor remained frigid. He measured wood consumption meticulously, calculating that his fireplace converted most of its fuel into heat that escaped through the roof rather than warming the space where he lived. The mathematics were frustrating. For every cord of wood he burned, perhaps 1/3 of the heat actually warmed his cabin. The rest went up the chimney or leaked through gaps in the stone. He visited other cabins in camp, examining fireplace construction with new, critical attention. Every structure used the same basic design: stone or brick built upward from the floor against an exterior wall, with a chimney extending through the roof to create draft. The design was universal because it worked adequately, but adequacy was no longer sufficient for Elias. Owen had died in an adequate cabin with an adequate fireplace that had failed at the worst possible moment. In late December, Elias sought out Abel Garrett, an older prospector who had worked in Pennsylvania quarries before coming west. Abel had a reputation for quality stonework, and his cabin showed more careful construction than most. Elias found him outside, splitting kindling on a clear, cold afternoon. "I need to understand thermal mass," Elias said without preamble. Abel straightened, studying Elias with interest. "That's a specific question. What brought you to thermal mass?" Trying to figure out why fireplaces waste so much heat, Abel set down his axe and invited Elias inside. His cabin was noticeably warmer than others Elias had visited, though the fireplace looked similar to standard construction. Abel explained that he had built thicker walls around his firebox and used denser stone selected specifically for heat retention. "Stone absorbs heat while fire burns," Abel said, running his hand along the fireplace wall. "Then it releases that heat slowly over hours." But most fireplaces have thin walls because thick stone is heavy work. So the heat goes straight up the chimney instead of into the stone. Elias absorbed this information, recognizing a principle he could use. What if the fire was surrounded by stone on all sides? Not just backed by it? You'd need a lot of stone. And you'd still have the draft problem. Heat wants to go up, not out into your cabin. That night, Elias lay in his bedroll thinking about heat and gravity. Fireplaces fought against natural laws. Heat rose vertically through chimneys while living spaces spread horizontally. The entire system seemed designed to send warmth away from where it was needed. He thought about root cellars, which stayed cool in summer because they were dug into earth. The ground itself provided insulation. What if that principle worked in reverse? What if fire could be surrounded by earth and stone, using the ground as insulation, while thermal mass radiated heat upward into the living space? The idea seemed absurd at first. Nobody built fires below floor level. Conventional wisdom said fire belonged in fireplaces, elevated and vented. But conventional wisdom had killed Owen Carlyle. Elias decided conventional wisdom might be wrong. February brought a brief thaw to Silver Ridge, and Elias began the work that would make him either vindicated or a laughingstock. On the first morning, when temperatures climbed above freezing, he moved his few pieces of furniture against the cabin walls and marked a circle 4 feet in diameter in the center of his floor. He pried up the floorboards carefully, stacking them outside for later use. Beneath the boards lay hard-packed earth, still partially frozen despite the warming air. He started digging with a short-handled pickaxe, the only tool that would work in the confined space. The work was brutal. Each swing of the pick had to be controlled to avoid hitting the floor joists. The frozen ground yielded reluctantly, coming up in small chunks rather than clean shovelfuls. Elias could only dig for 20 minutes before his shoulders and back demanded rest. He hauled dirt outside in a wooden bucket, dumping it in a growing pile behind his cabin. After the first full day of work, he had excavated 8 inches of depth. At that rate, reaching 4 feet would take weeks. Victor Ashford visited on the 3rd day, drawn by curiosity about the dirt pile and the rhythmic sound of digging. He stood in the doorway, staring at the hole in the center of Elias's floor with undisguised disbelief. "You've lost your mind," Victor said flatly. "You're digging your own grave, Drummond." "I'm digging a fire pit," Elias replied, not stopping his work. "Fire belongs in a fireplace, not a hole in the ground." "You planning to cook like an Indian? Sleep in a teepee next? Planning to stay warm without burning through a cord every 4 days?" Victor shook his head. "You'll burn your floor down. Or fill that hole with water come spring, melt, or suffocate from smoke. I've seen men go strange after losing partners, but this is something else." Word spread through camp quickly. Men found excuses to stop by, ostensibly to borrow tools or share news, actually to see the crazy prospector digging a pit in his cabin floor. The consensus was unanimous. Elias had broken under the weight of Owen's death. Some pitied him, others mocked him openly. A few suggested he should leave the mountains before he hurt himself. Silas Kern visited in early March, watching Elias work for several minutes before speaking. "What's the principle here?" "I'm trying to understand what you're thinking." Elias appreciated the genuine question. He explained thermal mass, heat retention, using earth as insulation, surrounding fire with stone instead of backing it with stone. Silas listened carefully but left looking unconvinced. By mid-March, Elias had reached his target depth of 4 feet. The pit was roughly circular, 3 feet in diameter at the bottom, widening slightly toward the top. He stood at the bottom, looking up at the cabin ceiling, now 8 feet above his head. The earthen walls were unstable and damp, prone to crumbling. He knew the next phase would be even more demanding than the digging. He needed stone, and lots of it, carefully selected and precisely placed. The real work was just beginning. Spring arrived in earnest by April, melting snow and exposing the rocky bones of the mountain. Elias spent the first clear days scouting for stone, accompanied occasionally by Abel Garrett, who had offered advice despite his own skepticism about the project. They hiked to various outcroppings and talus slopes, examining different types of rock, with the care of jewelers selecting diamonds. Abel showed Elias how to test stone for thermal properties. They built a small fire and placed samples directly in the flames, then doused them with cold water. Sandstone crumbled almost immediately under the thermal shock. Limestone cracked with sharp reports. But granite held firm, showing no damage even after repeated heating and cooling cycles. "Granite's what you want," Abel said, turning a smoke-blackened piece in his hands. "Dense, stable, handles temperature changes without breaking apart. It's also heavy as sin and hard to shape, but nothing's perfect." Elias found his source 2 miles from camp, a rock slide from decades earlier that had deposited thousands of granite pieces across a steep slope. He spent a week there, selecting stones with obsessive care. He wanted pieces with at least one flat face for stacking. He rejected anything with significant cracks or flaws. He looked for uniform thickness, knowing that irregular stones would create unstable walls. Each stone he selected had to be carried back to his cabin, and many weighed 40 to 60 pounds. He fashioned a rough sled from pine branches and rope, loading it with as many stones as he could drag through the forest. The trips were exhausting. The route from the rock slide climbed 500 vertical feet, threading through dense timber where the sled caught on roots and deadfall. He made the journey 12 times over 2 weeks, accumulating a pile of granite outside his cabin that drew curious stares from passing prospectors. Abel visited to teach dry-laying technique, an approach Elias had never encountered. "You're not using mortar?" Elias asked, confused. "Mortar cracks," Abel explained. "Heat makes stone expand. Cold makes it contract. Mortar can't flex, so it cracks and falls out. Then your wall fails." He demonstrated with 2 stones, showing how they could be fitted together with tiny gaps between them. Dry-laid stone rests on stone. The gaps are too small to see, but they let the stones move a hair's width when temperature changes. That movement is what keeps the structure stable. Elias worried that gaps would let heat escape, but Abel dismissed the concern. Gaps also let moisture escape as steam, and they allow air infiltration for combustion. Your fire needs oxygen from somewhere. Construction began with the bottom course, stones laid directly on the tamped earth at the pit bottom. Elias tested each placement, ensuring stability before committing. He worked slowly, fitting stones like puzzle pieces, sometimes trying a dozen different orientations before finding one that worked. The walls rose at a rate of 6 inches per day. After a week, the stone lining reached 2 feet high. After 2 weeks, 3 feet. The process demanded absolute attention to detail, but the result was walls that felt solid and permanent. By late May, the stone shaft stood complete at 4 feet deep, its dry-laid granite walls rising from the pit bottom to meet the cabin floor. But Elias faced a critical problem that had nagged at him throughout construction. Where stone met wood at the opening, combustible floorboards came within inches of where flames would burn. The radiant heat from the pit would char the wood over time, and any errant ember that escaped the shaft could ignite the floor. He needed a barrier, something substantial enough to protect the structure while serving the system's purpose. The solution came to him while examining flat stones near the creek. He needed coping stones, thick granite slabs that would form a protective rim around the pit opening. These stones would create a buffer zone between fire and floor while adding thermal mass that could absorb and radiate heat. Finding suitable pieces proved challenging. He needed slabs at least 3 inches thick with relatively flat top and bottom surfaces. After days of searching along the riverbed, he located 4 pieces that would work, each weighing approximately 80 pounds. Transporting them required careful planning. He rolled each slab onto his sled individually, making 4 separate trips from the creek to his cabin. His back ached from the effort, but when he laid the stones out around his pit opening, he saw they would fit together like pieces of a puzzle, their irregular edges complementing each other. Installation demanded precision he had not needed for the shaft walls. The coping stones had to sit perfectly level. Any tilt would look wrong and potentially create instabilities. He cut recesses into the floor joists surrounding the pit, creating ledges for the stones to rest on. Each stone required multiple test fittings, with Elias chiseling and adjusting the recesses until the fit was exact. He worked on the first stone for an entire afternoon, lowering it into position repeatedly, marking high spots, removing it to chisel the recess deeper, then testing again. When he finally achieved a level placement, he moved to the second stone. This one had to mate with the first, while also sitting level independently. The process took 2 more days of patient adjustment. When all 4 coping stones were finally in place, they formed a protective rim that extended 8 inches beyond the pit opening on all sides. Small gaps between the stones allowed for thermal expansion following Abel's dry-laying principles. The result was a substantial barrier that separated the wooden floor from the fire below by stone mass and airspace. Elias discovered an unexpected benefit during his first test burn. The coping stones absorbed heat from the rising warmth and radiated it outward for hours after the fire died. They functioned as a secondary thermal battery, extending the system's heat output well beyond the burn time of the fuel. His next challenge was practical rather than structural. Managing a fire 4 feet below floor level with a standard poker was impossible. The angle was wrong, the reach inadequate. He needed a specialized tool, something designed specifically for deep pit fire management. He would need help from someone who understood metalwork. Frank Mercer ran a small forge at the lower end of camp, doing basic metalwork for prospectors who needed tools repaired or modified. Elias found him on a June morning, shaping a pickaxe head over glowing coals. Frank listened to Elias's description of the problem with obvious interest, setting down his hammer to sketch ideas in the dirt outside his workshop. "You need reach and angle both," Frank said, drawing lines to represent the pit and a theoretical tool. "Standard poker is maybe 3 feet long, straight. You're working 4 feet down, and you need to reach the center of your fire from the rim. That's geometry working against you," they calculated, together. A 5-foot rod with a 45-degree bend, 18 inches from the working end, would allow Elias to stand at the pit rim and manipulate fuel at the bottom. Frank agreed to forge the tool, partly from curiosity about whether Elias's strange project would actually function. He completed the work in 2 days, creating a heavy iron poker with the specified bend and a comfortable grip wrapped in leather at the handle end. Elias paid Frank with silver ore from his claim and returned to his cabin to conduct the first real test of his system. He built a small fire at the pit bottom using kindling and dry pine. Smoke rose naturally through the shaft, drawn upward by the temperature differential and the slight draft created by the cabin's air leaks. The bent poker allowed him to adjust the fuel placement easily, reaching every part of the firebed without strain. Within an hour, the stones lining the shaft began radiating noticeable heat. Elias placed his hand near the coping rim and felt warmth that intensified as the fire burned. After 2 hours of steady burning, he let the fire die down to coals, then to ash. The stones continued releasing heat. He monitored the temperature carefully, noting that the coping stone stayed warm enough to be uncomfortable to touch for 6 hours after the flames expired. The shaft walls retained heat even longer, creating a gentle warmth that radiated upward into the cabin. Over the following weeks, Elias conducted systematic tests. He burned fires of different sizes and durations, measuring wood consumption against heat output and retention time. He discovered that a hot fire maintained for 2 hours charged the thermal mass sufficiently to keep the cabin comfortable overnight. Larger fires wasted wood, sending excess heat up through the chimney effect without meaningfully increasing the stone's temperature. Smaller fires worked nearly as well as large ones, provided they burned hot rather than smoldering. By September, Elias had refined his technique to the point of confidence. A single cord of wood, which previously lasted 4 days in his old fireplace, now stretched to 7 days with the pit system. The heat was steadier, more reliable, and required less constant attention. He began stockpiling wood for winter, needing significantly less than previous years. Other prospectors noticed his smaller woodpile and made predictable jokes about the man who had dug a hole in his floor, expecting it to keep him warm. Winter came to Silver Ridge with typical severity in December of 1877, and Elias's heat pit performed flawlessly through weeks of sustained cold. While other prospectors burned wood frantically to maintain minimal warmth, Elias heated his cabin with 2-hour fires that charged his thermal mass for overnight comfort. His wood consumption remained a fraction of what neighbors used, and his cabin stayed warmer with less effort. Victor Ashford stopped mocking and started asking occasional questions, though he never admitted the system might have merit. Early January brought ominous signs. The sky turned a peculiar yellowish gray that veteran mountain men recognized as a storm indicator. Temperatures dropped steadily over 3 days, falling from 10 above zero to 5 below, then to 15 below. Barometric pressure plummeted, animals disappeared into shelter. On January 13th, Margaret Holloway made a rare winter trip up from the trading post to warn the scattered prospectors that something unprecedented was approaching. "Biggest storm I've seen building in 20 years, she told Elias, accepting coffee in his unusually warm cabin. "You should have supplies for a week, at minimum." The blizzard hit Silver Ridge on the morning of January 14th with a fury that exceeded even Margaret's warning. Elias woke to wind that sounded like continuous thunder, shaking his cabin's walls and finding every minor gap in the construction. Snow fell so thickly that visibility dropped to zero within minutes. The temperature had fallen to 28 degrees below zero, and the wind drove the cold through any opening it could penetrate. Elias lit his pit fire and settled in to wait. The wind screamed outside, but the flames in his shaft burned steadily, protected 4 feet below floor level where gusts could not reach them. He tended the fire for 2 hours, using his bent poker to arrange fuel for maximum heat output, then let it burn down naturally. The stones absorbed the thermal energy and began their slow release of warmth into the cabin space. 12 hours into the storm, conditions worsened. The wind intensified beyond anything Elias had experienced, shaking his cabin so violently he worried about structural failure. Snow piled against the walls, creating drifts that reached halfway up the door. The temperature continued dropping. He lit another fire, recharging his thermal mass, then extinguished it to conserve wood. The system worked exactly as designed, maintaining livable temperature without requiring constant burning. At hour 24, the storm showed no sign of diminishing. Elias burned a third fire, noting that he had used less than a quarter cord of wood while maintaining consistent warmth. In a standard fireplace scenario, he would have burned through 2 full cords by now and still been cold. Hour 30 brought sounds that alarmed him, sharp cracks echoing through the forest as trees snapped under snow weight and wind pressure. He heard what might have been a cabin collapsing somewhere in camp, a heavy thud followed by the wind's relentless howl. He checked his pit, saw the warm glow of stone still radiating heat, and understood that, whatever was happening outside, his innovation was keeping him alive. The storm finally broke on the morning of January 16th after 42 hours of sustained violence. Elias woke to silence so profound it felt unnatural after 2 days of constant wind. He opened his door carefully, pushing against snow that had drifted against the entrance, and stepped into a transformed world. Drifts reached 10 feet high in places, burying familiar landmarks completely. Trees he had known for years were snapped off at mid-height or bent to the ground under snow weight. The sky was clear and bitterly cold, the air so frigid it hurt to breathe. He struggled through waist-deep snow toward Victor Ashford's cabin, 50 yards downslope. No smoke rose from Victor's chimney, which filled Elias with dread. He reached the door and pounded on it, calling Victor's name. After a long moment, he heard movement inside, and a weak voice telling him to enter. Victor sat wrapped in every blanket he owned, shivering violently despite the layers. His fireplace was cold and dark, filled with ash from a fire that had died hours earlier. The cabin felt like a tomb, barely warmer than outside. Chimney clogged, Victor managed through chattering teeth. Tried to keep fire going, but wind kept killing it. Burned all the wood I could reach. Too cold to go outside for more. Elias helped Victor to his feet and half carried him through the snow to his own cabin. Inside, the heat pit stones were still releasing warmth from the fire Elias had burned 6 hours earlier. Victor collapsed near the pit opening, holding his hands over the warm coping stones, his face showing profound relief and something else that might have been shame. Elias lit a fresh fire and made hot coffee while Victor slowly recovered. Then he went to check other cabins. He found Frank Mercer alive but hypothermic in a cabin where the fireplace had failed similarly to Victor's. Elias brought Frank back to his cabin, the only structure in camp maintaining reliable heat. Over the next 2 days, as men dug out from the storm, the full toll became clear. 4 prospectors had frozen to death in their cabins across 3 nearby camps. 2 more were found dead in a collapsed structure that had failed under snow weight. A dozen others had survived only by burning furniture, huddling together for warmth or sheer luck. The common thread among the dead was fireplace failure, chimneys clogged with ice, downdrafts extinguishing flames, fuel burning too fast to maintain heat through the storm's duration. Elias's cabin had been the only structure that maintained independent, reliable warmth throughout the entire blizzard. He had used less than half a cord of wood, while others burned through 3 cords and still froze. The innovation that Victor had called a grave, that Silas had questioned, that the whole camp had mocked, had proven itself under the worst possible conditions. Men stood in Elias's cabin, staring at the stone-lined pit in his floor, finally understanding what he had built and why it mattered. Spring of 1878 brought Silas Kern to Elias's door with a request that would have seemed absurd a year earlier. He wanted help designing a heat pit for his own cabin. Elias spent 3 weeks that April working with Silas, teaching him stone selection, dry-laying technique, and the principles of thermal mass management. Silas's pit ended up slightly different from the original, shallower but wider, adapted to his cabin's layout and available materials. But the core principles remained: deep excavation, stone lining, protective coping rim, and reliance on thermal storage rather than constant burning. Victor Ashford came next, swallowing considerable pride to ask for assistance. His pit took longer to build because Victor insisted on understanding every decision, questioning each aspect of the design until he grasped the underlying physics. By summer's end, 2 more prospectors had begun excavations. By the following spring, 8 cabins in Silver Ridge camps featured deep-dug heat pits in various configurations. The technique spread beyond the immediate area through the informal network of trappers, prospectors, and remote settlers who moved through the high country. Men who had visited Silver Ridge and seen the pits carried the knowledge to other camps. Settlers in exposed locations adopted variations suited to their circumstances. Not everyone built them. The labor was substantial, stone access was not universal, and many locations did not face severe enough conditions to justify the effort. But in the highest, coldest, most isolated places where winter could kill, where men had watched neighbors freeze, the deep-dug heat pit became a proven solution. The innovation acquired different names in different regions. Some called them Drummond pits, after Elias. Others used descriptive terms like deep-dug hearths or stone shafts. Elias never tried to claim credit or profit from the design. He shared his methods freely with anyone who asked, considering the knowledge too important to hoard. He continued prospecting through the 1880s with modest success, never striking the rich vein that would make him wealthy, but earning enough to live comfortably. His body began showing the wear of mountain life as he approached 50. The altitude affected his breathing. Old injuries from mining accidents accumulated. In 1889, he left Silver Ridge for the last time, moving to Boulder, where the lower elevation and steady work as a stonemason offered a gentler existence. He married in 1890, started a small family, and lived quietly until his death in 1891 at age 54, from lung complications that doctors attributed to years of breathing cold mountain air and rock dust. His obituary in the Boulder newspaper mentioned his stonework reputation, but said nothing about heat pits or innovations that had saved lives. But in the mountains, in cabins scattered across the high country, stone-lined shafts continued functioning exactly as designed. Prospectors and settlers survived winters in pit-heated structures, burning less wood and sleeping warmer than their predecessors. The innovation, outlived its creator by decades. A legacy built not in words or patents, but in carefully stacked stone, proving that sometimes the best solutions come from necessity, observation, and one man's refusal to accept that frozen partners were simply the cost of mountain life.